Cortez and the Conquest of Mexico. One of the most fascinating and exciting stories in the history of the Spanish colonization of the Americas is the account of Hernando Cortes' conquest of Mexico. This conquest was a major event in the history of Spanish colonization for two reasons. It was the first time that the New World yielded up a significant amount of gold and treasure. And furthermore, the conquest brought the vast territories of Mexico under Spanish rule. The major credit for the conquest goes to Hernando Cortes. Hernando Cortes was born here in Medellin, Spain, in 1485. As you know, Europe at that time was beginning to show great interest in exploration and world trade. Prince Henry of Portugal was busy collecting information which would eventually lead to the discovery of a water route to India. Columbus had already proposed his idea of sailing westward in order to reach Asia to King John of Portugal. By the time Cortes was 7 years old, Columbus had reached the New World, thinking that he had found Asia. Some years later, it was realized that a new continent had been discovered. When this fact became known, Spain began colonization in earnest. By the time Cortes reached manhood, the New World was the byword of the day. At Salamanca University, he began the study of law, but he soon lost interest, for he wanted a life of adventure. A quiet, easy existence in his native country did not appeal to Cortes. He left Salamanca without having finished his studies. The young Cortes wandered to Cadiz, where sailors told of the marvels of the West. The New World seemed the answer to his dreams. Why should he not travel to the West Indies, settle down, and make his fortune? Such a venture involved a number of risks, but Cortes was more than willing to take them. In 1504, Cortes sailed for San Domingo, where he lived as a planter until 1511. San Domingo is known today as the Dominican Republic. Its first settlers were mainly planters like Cortes, who learned that agricultural products could bring them almost as much wealth as gold itself. Despite the fact that he was becoming wealthy, however, Cortes was not quite satisfied with his life. It lacked adventure, so he decided to pursue his fortunes elsewhere. Then an expedition under Diego Velazquez brought him to Cuba. While living quietly on his plantation, he planned a daring enterprise to explore and conquer Mexico to the west. Military exploits appealed to him. Besides, little was known about Mexico. Quite possibly it held the treasure trove the Spanish were seeking. Cortes wanted to be the first to arrive. But now he found his ambition opposed. Governor Velazquez grew jealous of the young Cortes who wished to conquer Mexico. The governor instructed him to leave Mexico alone. Cortes chose to ignore the governor's orders. By 1519, Cortes had gathered around him a rough band, a strong force of 500 men. Gold and adventure were the prizes they sought. These soldiers of fortune did not belong to the regular Spanish army, because Cortes' expedition was being made without official authorization. Once all the preparations had been made, Cortes and his men set out without informing the governor. Before the enraged Velazquez could stop them, 11 small ships carried them, their horses, and cannon across the water. Soon the ships reached their destination. On the Mexican coast, they fought a brief, victorious battle. Cortes won the aid of Marina, a beautiful Indian girl. She belonged to the small tribe of Indians Cortes had defeated. She explained to Cortes that the most important Indian nation was to be found farther inland. These Indians were called Aztecs. They had reached an extremely high level of civilization compared to the other Indian tribes in the Americas. Cortes' interest quickened. Such Indians would doubtless have great wealth. Meanwhile, fast-running Aztec messengers were drawing for their emperor, Montezuma, pictures of firearms, horses, and white-faced gods. The Aztecs assumed that these invaders were gods because they obviously were not Indians, and because they brought with them such marvels as horses, muskets, and shiny steel armor. The Aztec observers were careful to observe all of these details. And in his palace, Montezuma sat remembering a legend from the depths of his people's past. The legend concerned the principal Aztec deity, Quetzalcoatl. In the days of long ago, legend said, a white god, Quetzalcoatl, once ruled Mexico, and his reign had been blessed with peace and prosperity. For some unexplained reason, the white god decided to leave the Aztecs. On a raft of snakes, Quetzalcoatl had left the shores of Mexico. But Aztecs still cherished the hope he would one day bring them back the golden age. He had said he would return someday as he sailed westward into the sunset. The Aztecs concluded that since these new visitors were white-skinned, since they came over the western sea, and since they had miraculous firearms, they had to be a troop of gods, led by Quetzalcoatl. The Aztecs wrongly assumed that the golden age had begun again. So Montezuma sent gifts of welcome to the white god. At the site of Veracruz, the ambassadors from the Aztec monarch greeted the invaders. Cortez was somewhat surprised at the welcome he received. He had expected a struggle. Instead, he was greeted as a god. The men of Europe gazed unbelievingly at the wealth of the fabulous land. All of this was to be turned over to them without a single battle. The Spaniards could hardly believe their luck. To make retreat impossible, Cortez ordered the burning of all the ships. With so much wealth at his disposal, Cortez knew there would be no difficulty building others when the time came. And so started the march inland to Tenochtitlan, capital of untold riches. It was in this city that Montezuma's court was to be found. It was located on the same spot where modern Mexico City is built. The Spaniards planned to reach it within a few weeks. In their path lay the country of the Talascalans. Although enemies of the Aztecs, these people valiantly fought the invaders of their lands. For one thing, they did not consider the Spaniards gods. For another, they did not realize that the Spaniards intended to subjugate their Aztec enemies. They assumed that the Spaniards and the Aztecs were allies. For these reasons, they began attacking Cortez's army. Soon convinced that they could not defeat the Spaniards, the Talascalan chiefs added the strength of several thousands to the forces of Spain. They learned that Cortez planned to take over the Aztec Empire and were quite willing to help him in this project. Through the mountains of Mexico moved a strange and powerful host, Spanish cavalry and Indian warriors. Cheerful and confident, the Spaniards and Talascalans marched along, mingling Spanish war songs and strange Indian chants. As they neared Tenochtitlan, capital of the Aztec Empire, they saw that 3 causeways connected the island city with the mainland. Cortez marveled at this jewel of a city set in the middle of a huge mountain lake. All of this will be mine, he said to himself. On the south causeway, the conqueror and the emperor met. At first, Montezuma was surprised to see the Talascalan warriors who accompanied the white god. But he concluded that these Indians must also have recognized Quetzalcoatl and had come to join the Aztecs in worshiping him. Well, he thought to himself, the god has already established peace between 2 enemy tribes. Surely the golden age has begun. And yet the emperor was troubled by another observation he made. None of the visitors spoke the Aztec language. How could that be, if they were Aztec gods? Cortez invited Montezuma to his quarters, where he treacherously made him a prisoner. Cortez forced him to pay ransom and bend to the Spanish will. Too late, Montezuma realized his mistake. These men were invaders, not gods, but since he was their captive, he had no choice but to submit. The Aztec nobles listened as their weeping emperor told them they must henceforth obey the Spaniards. They realized that instead of a golden age, an age of misery had begun. Soon, priests and people felt the severity of Spanish rule. To stop human sacrifice, Cortez destroyed the Aztec idols, to the horror of the people. It was bad enough that the Spaniards had turned out not to be gods themselves. Now they were even showing themselves to be enemies of the Aztec religion. Then Mexico saw another landing party, larger than the first. Velázquez had sent Panfilo Narvaez to capture Cortez, whom he had pronounced an outlaw. Cortez hurried to meet the challenger Narvaez. He left Alvarado, his trusted aide, with two-thirds of the army to guard the capital. Cortes refused to submit to Narvaez without a fight. In dark and rain, Cortes surprised and vanquished the sleeping enemy. He persuaded the great force to join with him, little suspecting how badly he was to need them. Cortes had defeated his European enemies, only to have them replaced by Indian ones. For Alvarado, fearing treachery, had massacred hundreds of innocent Aztecs, assembled for a religious parade, whereupon the Indians had broken into fierce revolt. They would accept no more interference with their religious practices. The returning Cortes marched into a city strangely quiet. Moonlight on empty streets and canals emphasized a foreboding hush. Where are the rebellious Indians? Cortes wondered to himself. Suddenly, thousands of enraged Aztecs poured their arrows into the air. They sprang out from doorways, behind low roofs, and from flat rooftops. Arrows and spears flew at the Spaniards from every angle. Cortes decided to play his trump card. Montezuma came in full regalia upon the fierce scene to command his subjects to disperse. In their anger, they stoned him, causing his death several days later. They were tired of the way Montezuma continually bowed to the will of the harsh invaders. They considered him fit to rule no longer. Thus the reign of Montezuma came to an inglorious end. Cortes was now hard-pressed. Food and water were running low. Retreat to the safety of the mountains seemed the only hope. Perhaps the Spaniards would be able to make a comeback once they had sufficient supplies. The once proud Spanish army crept, defeated, through the city streets, hoping to escape the Aztecs' wrath. As the Spaniards reached the main causeway, alert sentries raised the alarm. The great temple drum sounded. The Spanish were not going to be allowed to escape without a fight. Aztecs sprang to the attack. Frantic Spaniards jammed the causeway. There they died or were forced into the lake. They hardly made the effort to defend themselves. They were so intent on escaping the city. This was La Noche Triste, the sad night of terror. Hundreds of Spanish soldiers lay dead, either cut down by Aztec arrows or drowned in the lake. The low point of the Spanish fortunes had been reached. On the mainland, the few who had reached the shore rested, Cortes still among them. The undaunted leader began to consider what his next move should be, but his reflections were rudely interrupted. The Aztecs were moving out from the city and marching against the Spanish. Soon another battle raged, for the relentless Aztecs tried to cut off all retreat. Cortes could only hope to fight them off while his army retreated further. An offensive tactic was totally impossible at this moment. Battered and bloody, the remnants of the Spanish army straggled back to Talascalans, where loyal men and women cared for them. The Talascalans were disappointed that Cortes had had so little luck in his attempt to subjugate the Aztecs. They offered their help if Cortes wished to renew his attack. At Talascalans, Cortes began a daring comeback. Thousands of Indians carried the ships the 60 miles over the mountains to blockade the lake. The fact that Tenochtitlan was an island had its disadvantages as well as its advantages. The Aztecs could easily defend themselves from attack, but it was quite easy to keep them bottled up inside the city until they starved. This was exactly what Cortes planned to do. In their burning city, the Aztecs long and bitterly resisted the unequal siege. Flaming Talascalan arrows had set the city on fire, but the Aztecs lacked the water to extinguish the flames. The desperate Aztecs tricked 50 Spaniards into capture. To appease their gods and to terrify the invaders, all were sacrificed in view of their fellows. At last, thirst and starvation, as well as Spanish might, vanquished the Aztecs. Upon the scene of surrender looked Marina, who had helped bring their defeat. Tenochtitlan, the labor of centuries, lay in ruins. Slowly, Cortes began rebuilding. To reward Cortes' conquest, King Charles V had appointed him governor. Since the conquest was complete, Cortes decided to return for a visit to Europe. Back in the court of Spain, Cortes defended the cruelty of his government in Mexico. He claimed that it was impossible to deal with the Indians in any other manner. Charles V was tempted to accept his arguments, for the new territory was bringing much wealth to Spain. But enemies had poisoned the mind of court and king, and Cortes fell from the favor of his emperor. In spite of his contribution to Spain's wealth and power, he was deprived of his governorship. Cortes performed still another service for Spain. With his story of the Mexican conquest, he inspired a fascinated young listener, Pizarro, future conqueror of Peru. But this is another story. Hernando Cortes died in 1547, alone, friendless, heavily in debt. Mexico's great wealth did him no good, for he was deprived of the opportunity to appropriate any of it for himself. Honor came to Cortes only after death. He was the first of the great conquerors in America. His methods became the model for others who followed him. The final result of the effort of Cortes and his successors was the establishment of an immense empire in the Americas, which lasted until the 19th century. Thus, Cortes remains as the first and most striking example in history of that adventurous breed of men, the Spanish conquistadores.